More and more patients are turning to AI to help with their healthcare journey. This can be genuinely useful, and I'm speaking from experience, but it also creates a challenge for healthcare marketers. They have to be visible and accurate everywhere that both people and machines are looking for information. Here to share his perspective on how to do exactly that is Reed Smith, SVP and Chief Consumer Officer for Ardent Health. Let's get into it on our episode of the Visibility Brief. Hi, Reed. Welcome, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
Excellent. So you co-host Touchpoint, a weekly podcast about healthcare, and you're closing in on, the way I understand it, 9 years, 500 episodes. That is so many conversations. What inspired you to launch the podcast? And I'd be curious to know, how have the conversations changed since you started it?
Yeah, well, this is a great question. So yes, happy to be here. So Chris Boyer and I co-host Touchpoint. It's a weekly show, kind of around consumerism and experience in healthcare. And selfishly, we started this as just a reason for he and I to connect on a more regular basis. So we had both, at the time, were involved with some advisory work at the Mayo Clinic, and so we'd see each other in person a few times a year, and it was something that sounded, appealing to both of us and kind of forced both of us to stay current on what was happening in the industry, changes we were seeing in technology and different things like that. Social media was a big topic at the time. And so, yeah, it was just a good reason for us to do that. It just kind of accidentally turned into what it did. And so we feel fortunate that people still care enough to listen, 500 episodes later, that we still have something to say. So it's been fun. I think the conversation and the narrative has changed, and yet it hasn't all at the same time. I think here in recent memory, we've talked a lot about AI, certainly, but we were doing very similar things 9+ years ago, when social media and digital and online communities were such a big deal, around kind of peer-to-peer conversations in healthcare and things like that. And so, the more it changes, the more it stays the same, I guess. And so the topics, the technology, some of that changes, but it's been a lot of fun.
That's wonderful. I mean, welcome to the life of a marketer, right? It is
Right.
constantly changing. I've listened to a lot of the episodes, and it seems like a lot of your perspective is informed by your firsthand experience, as the SVP and Chief Consumer Officer at Ardent Health. Tell me more a little bit about your organization and your role there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been fortunate to be a part of a great organization the last 4 or 5 years. Ardent Health, based in Nashville, Tennessee. We have 30 hospitals, another close to 300 sites of care across 6 states, 8 different markets, and so we really have invested in community-based healthcare. So we're in medium-sized communities around the country. Think Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Albuquerque, New Mexico, Tyler, Texas, those types of markets, and it's been really great. I love those communities. I love those size organizations and the mission that everybody has to deliver care in those ways in those communities. I think my role is a little bit unique in a lot of ways. I joined Ardent originally to head up all of our digital and innovation initiatives. That's more a little bit over time to now include not just that, but what we call connected care and health enablement. So, kind of those non traditional care channels like telehealth and remote patient monitoring, chronic care management, wearables, et cetera. So, that along with innovation and kind of new products is really fun to be involved in. I have a lot of oversight of what we call access and experience. And so, how people find their way into the healthcare system, and then what people would consider kind of that legacy marketing and sales type function. So I have everything consumer facing of how people search, find, schedule, arrive for care, and so it's and the experience therein. So it's great. It's a lot of fun. I've got a great team.
I imagine the AI is having a really big impact on the patient experience, starting with how they find your organization. So, what are some of the bigger use cases you're seeing for where AI is becoming part of this process?
Yeah, we think about it in a couple of ways, and honestly, I think about it in a couple of ways. One is, certainly we're seeing AI change the way people do their work, right? And subsequently, we're seeing AI change the work. And so it's really kind of two different sides of the same coin, maybe. But I think, from a consumer's perspective, it's very common across the industry and really just in all walks of life that people are going to these models, if you will, to ask questions. Where you were typing a lot of things into the Google search engine not too long ago, we're seeing more and more people as every day goes by type those same questions and content into their agent of choice, whether that's Gemini or Claude or Chat GPT or whatever it may be. And then subsequently, we're seeing those groups return results in a very certain way. And so, even if you are still going to Google, you're seeing a lot of the kind of AI generated results. And so, for the consumer, we're seeing it change in how they search and find the information that they need. I think from us internally, thinking about the way that we do our work, there's a lot there. Obviously, it can help very much aid in the process and production of content materials. I mentioned I'm over creative services. There's a lot that's happening in that space. Certainly, Adobe's baking this into their creative suite, even. And so again, it's allowing us to think about, well, how does the work get done? Who does it? What does it look like? How do you drive more efficiencies in those ways? And then two, how can we rely on a lot of our technology partners that have put this in as part of their roadmap, whether that's our EHR or otherwise, to really change, how the work surfaces even.
It is such a disruptive time for sure. I'd like to talk a little bit more about the patient experience. So, are you finding patients are gravitating towards leveraging the AI to determine if they need care, or is it more along the lines of, I know I need care, now where do I go and find a
Yeah.
provider that accepts my insurance or, you know, is available?
Yeah, there's a little bit of both. I mean, certainly, at least from what I've read and seen and others I've talked to in the space, we're seeing a lot of, what we saw early on with the internet, right? Which was people looking for definitional content, finding answers, trying to understand what is it, how bad is it, what do I need to do now? Answering very practical kind of next step questions. And so, yes, very much understanding symptoms, conditions, etc. Which we went from the internet to symptom checkers and kind of triage tools to now that might be what this turns out to accomplish, right? I think that does lead you down a little bit of a linear path of like, well, what do I do next? Appropriateness of care. And so we've talked a lot through the years about, do you go to the ER? Do you go to the urgent care? Is this a primary care visit? Do I do virtual care? Do I just tough it out and wait at home? And so I think there's a chance that this helps solve some of those questions. But I do think with what we're seeing with answer engines, specifically when we were actually choosing care. So if you think about, the acuity going up or maybe chronic illness or conditions, things like that, where you're doing a lot of research around the provider, maybe the procedure, the clinical trials, all those parts and pieces, it really can aid in that of pulling all that information together, helping you distill it down of really what's important. What does this mean? And I think there's a lot of opportunity there. We try to make sure the appropriateness of care is right, and so this I think has the chance to help people do that.
I've been thinking a bit about the shortage of healthcare providers that we have, nationwide, especially in rural areas. And I imagine this can be an incredible tool for determining, do I need to drive 45 minutes, to get the care I need, or can this wait until tomorrow? And you also mentioned virtual services. So I'm curious, do you see AI empowering your teams to deliver better care or more care or increase access in particular ways?
I hope so. I think we're still early in that journey. Certainly, we the industry. I mean, early in that journey. I think the hope is that turns out to be the case. I think what we can all agree on is that we're not going to have enough primary care doctors anytime soon. Like that's just the math is not there, right? And so if we think about um, the levels of care, where you're going for what, and the appropriateness of that care, like we were just talking about. I hope from an agentic perspective, we've got a way to help people manage some of their chronic conditions, diabetes, hypertension, things like that. It's not that people don't need to see a doctor in person, they very much do. But how do we help load balance, I guess, is maybe some way to think about it, to make sure that the people get in that really need to get in right that minute, that we're able to reduce some of the lead time, wait time, et cetera. You mentioned kind of the rural or maybe underserved communities. I still think we've got to solve some of the SDOH pieces around broadband, for example, health literacy potentially, depending on the areas. So again, there's still some gatekeeping to some of this, but I do think the demand is there. Certainly, it's hard for us to have enough providers. I don't care where you are in the country. And so serving that kind of unmet need, I guess, we hope the promise of AI is true, that we're able to see some of this come to fruition.
From a marketing perspective, have you seen evidence of patients or potential patients using AI more? Are you seeing that evidence show up in your metrics anywhere?
We do. I think it's interesting because the KPIs, or the measurement, if you will, has changed a lot through the years for a marketer. Early on, everything was very eyeball centric. How many impressions did we get? Then we moved into conversions and some things like that. And even now, we have a better chance to show true attribution of our outreach or our campaigns and things like that. I think as we've seen answer engines and some of these pieces come online where people are searching for care, we are seeing more bots on the sites. We are seeing less people to the homepage, for example. And we're seeing more conversions without really website visits in a lot of cases. And so, again, I think that the premise that we've held for a while with, I'll say, Google, for example, is still true, meaning, zero click search is still a thing. They're wanting to serve everything up to you and make it to where you don't necessarily have to leave that search result page. I think that is still right. As we see knowledge cards and we're building in scheduling functionality there, we're kind of skipping over the website, so to speak, in a lot of cases. You still have to have a website, of course. It still has to be, where you're hosting and serving a lot of this information from. You still have to be able to drive trust from it. Um, but it's a very different experience than it used to be, where just everybody was kind of entering through the homepage of your website. I think as we think about what the front door means, that definition is really changing quite a bit.
How are you thinking about feeding those LLMs the information they need, information about your providers, locations, insurances that you accept? Um, how are you feeding that to LLMs?
Yeah, and I think that's where the website still plays a
Right.
real role. I think there are very few organizations in the country, that are a destination for content in and of itself. We've thought about Cleveland Clinic in these ways. We've thought about Mayo Clinic. All the big logos that somebody might, Hopkins or Cedars or MD Anderson for cancer or whatever it may be. But the vast majority of hospitals are not that, and that's not really the business that they're in, of creating consumable kind of definitional content, right? They're not a content engine. And so I think what LLMs have done is allowed for some level setting for the consumer of getting the answer they need and then being able to take the action they need. And so, a lot of that action is local. And so having those specialties, the location, the availability, so i.e. scheduling, for example, hosted in a way that is consumable by these LLMs, I think is really important.
You've also mentioned on one of your past episodes that the patient experience itself starts long before they walk into one of your locations. And it really starts with the research and then the booking process, and how information accuracy is absolutely vital. So, walk me through that a little bit more. Like, what happens to the patient when they're getting the wrong information?
Yeah. Well, I, you know, Turns out healthcare's not low consequence in a lot of in a lot of ways. I mean, you're not buying something off, I don't know, Amazon or whatever. And if the wrong thing shows up, it's not the end of the world. You return it, you get the right one or whatever. And so again, there's reasons people end up inside of a healthcare system, and some of those are very much convenience based, location based, availability. Do they take my insurance? And most of those are episodic or kind of lower on the acuity scale. I think, certainly as chronic illness or the acuity rises, you know the stakes go up. You need to make sure that you have the right information for the folks that are looking for it at the time that they're looking. So in best case, you're just frustrating somebody. Worst case, you're putting them in potentially a bad spot from a care perspective. And so we certainly want to make sure that we're delivering the right information at the right time. But it does start well before, hey, I need to book an appointment, right? And so some of this goes back to how are you putting the information in front of them? How accessible is your information correct? And so again, it's funny because even though we're talking about AI, you still end up back to conversations you've had for years around taxonomy and data governance and some of the hygiene and structure pieces that power and allow a lot of this to work. So the things you've built for your physician directory in years past is still true. And so, how do you work with those partners, whoever that may be, around your listings, around your provider information, to make sure it's correct, because that's where a lot of this is getting picked up from.
Sounds like a lot hasn't changed, but I'm sure a lot has. Have you, like, what do you think has changed the most in your job as a healthcare marketer, say over the past 5 years?
If I think back even further, if I think back initially, 25 years ago, it was a lot around awareness. It was a lot about community relations, and those things are all still important. We're a lot of times a large employer in a town, and it's important to be connected there. And that's true for a lot of folks around the country. I think what has changed is the amount of information we know about a person at any given time. And so I think what that next best action is, we're much more informed and have the ability to help them in that journey than probably we ever have been before. We have an awful lot in our EHRs. We have an awful lot coming in through feedback mechanisms like HCAPs, like patient family advisory councils, notes through the portal, for example. People are telling us stuff all the time. What are we doing with that information? How are we aggregating it? How are we using that to better a process? What does that look like? Um, that's not really the problem. Like the lack of information is not the problem. And so I think for the first time we really have an opportunity to help people in their journey, probably different than we ever have before.
It's amazing. Earlier, you mentioned some of the things that your team is doing to leverage AI to be more efficient. I'd love to dig into that a little bit more.
There's a couple of things that we look at from a process perspective. So certainly creative services is one of those. A lot of content gets created. You think about some of the SEO and optimization around what is written and put online. Certainly there's a role for AI there. I think as we look at the reporting and analysis of what's happening across our organization, even outside of just purely our marketing outreach, there's a lot of pieces there as well. Looking at the insights from what and kind of marrying those up. It would have been a really hard project to say, hey, our physician outreach individuals are hearing this and they've documented this in the PRM. And then we're seeing this in HCAPS, and we're seeing this in our Google reviews, and we're seeing this from our patient family. To try to crosswalk all of that information around the idea of experience, it would be really tedious and take somebody a lot of time to try to figure out, well, how do I thematically make sense of all of this? That's becoming almost an instantaneous answer in a lot of ways. And so I think, again, anywhere that you have inputs and data coming in, you've got the ability to drive insights. And so that's an interesting one. We're seeing other things from an AI perspective, especially evolving how we do our work. So you think about we're doing a lot with ambient scribing right now with our clinicians, and kind of changing the way that they do their work and reducing some of that burden and burnout potential there. So there's a lot. There's certainly a lot. I can think of a million use cases, and again, some of it's that's maybe the hard part as well is how do we prioritize it? Where do you start? Where's the most value here? But we do. We've got ways in my shop where we're using agents to proof documents, to audit landing pages, to audit content and repurpose content across different channels. There's all kinds of stuff. There really is. I think we've last count just inside my department have built somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 or so different prompts that just the creative team is using to make their work more efficient.
Are you a purist anyway? In any way? Is there something that you would refuse to allow AI to touch?
That's a good question. My knee jerk is no. I'm not saying there's not. I can't think of one off the top of my head. I do think there is something to be said. Again, going back to creative services, I don't want to make it sound like we've just automated the entire world. I think you talk about the need for judgment, right? And so a lot of what we do is human in the loop. And so, again, how do we better a process, make things more efficient? Humans are still in the loop, making a lot of judgment calls. And I think in the creative services space is a good example of where we are talking about pure creative production. Um, Style is something that I'm not sure AI is quite there. And I don't mean like, can it figure out your slide deck template? That's pretty easy. But when you're looking at, how do we inject warmth and tone and some of those things into what we do, again, that probably still skews towards the human side. It probably will for some time. So
I'm with you on that. And I think when we leverage AI effectively for the more tedious projects, like taking a slide deck and tweaking it to be consistent everywhere, it frees up creatives and marketers to make better judgment calls. We're pivoting into our final section. This is the practical advice for your peers section. We talk about what people should stop, start, and reconsider. So let's start with the start section. What do you think is one thing marketers should start paying closer attention to?
folks should really spend a lot of time figuring out how to get all of their strategic partners together and understand kind of what those roadmaps look like. I think we've heard plenty of product pitches. That's not really what I mean. But kind of where are they headed relative to AI or kind of the evolution of technology? I think it's going to be important to understand if you have some real strategic partners, not vendors, the people that you've really partnered with to move the business forward, to make sure everybody's aligned. Again, it's an interesting exercise to try to get some of those folks together, get their product roadmaps, understand where they're going, and try to figure out, does this align with, the opportunity, with the problem we're trying to solve, or not?
Is there an assumption people have made about healthcare marketing in the past that you think no longer holds true?
When I started 25 years ago, um, I don't say marketing much anymore because it became pretty obvious to me a few years ago. It's been a number of years ago now that marketing meant advertising to most folks. Again, right, wrong, or indifferent. And I think there's a lot more to what we do, and at least what my department is in, charged with doing, than advertising. That a part of the equation? Sure. But I think, there's an opportunity there to kind of reframe that. And so again, I'm not sure that's fair, but it's reality, and that's just kind of where we are. But that's kind of the way that I think about it. Yeah,
Maybe as marketers, we need to market ourselves a little bit, change the
yeah,
perception
yeah,
of
yeah. I mean,
value.
that's fair. Absolutely, absolutely. But again, in a lot of reasons, that's why I'm, It's called consumerism, or I'm the chief consumer officer. Is to try to kind of get a better sense for it's not just about awareness and advertising. It is about consumer engagement.
Right, right. Absolutely. These were fantastic insights. If people want to hear more about your ideas and connect with you, how can they do that?
Yeah, best way is probably to track me down is LinkedIn. I'm relatively easy to find there. There's not a lot of people with my name, at least, that do what I do. So, but you can find me there. Touchpoint.health is the website for the podcast. You can find us there as well.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate the insights, and have a great one.
Thanks for having me.
That's a wrap on this episode of the Visibility Brief. If you found this useful, subscribe, leave us a review, or send this to a colleague who needs to hear it. We'll see you next time.